subscriber, we've got to punch you up. So please stand by.
Hello, folks. How's it going? Y'all registered to vote yet? If not, pay very close attention to the following missive. We're nearing the elections, which means it's time to start campaigning for free on behalf of people whose salaries we pay, which we do so that they allow us to do what we'd already be doing without them, and then applaud them if the bottle of piss we're made to imbibe yearly happens to be an ounce lighter. Get your flags, shirts, caps, mugs, Brazilian waxes, and butt plugs emblazoned with your candidate's logo, because it's time to rock the fucking vote. I know. Deciding which Satan-worshipping pedophile should have access to nuclear weaponry can get pretty wiry, but worry not. This is why we have the marketplace of ideas, so that we can work our asses off to articulately plead for the mercy of psychopaths who will ultimately get their way anyways. Where would we be without depleting our energy arguing controversial and delicate topics, like whether men are women or if pedophilia is okay? It's our right as Americans to have our rights and livelihoods put on the chopping block every 4 years. You might not be a fan of democracy, but as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. But I'm sure Churchill knew what he was saying, considering he did a lot of awesome stuff like bombing Dresden and covering up Soviet mass execution of Polish people. Having all that in mind, let's all strap in and slowly but steadily subvert all the values that made our societies prosperous in the first place. And remember, if you think any of this is immoral and you want no part of it, the people who are voting against your interests will prevail, so you don't get to not participate. Seriously though, how's being political going for you? Must be pretty fulfilling paying attention to news channels that become more irrelevant and unreliable by the minute, regularly posting your opinions on social media and having the time of your life when you get to debate an aging family member or a random schizophrenic transsexual that was stupid enough to reply. The funniest part is I get called black-pilled when I point out how pointless and pathetic this shit is. I ought to get excited, right? I'm supposed to convince myself that we'll time travel back to when things were good if a guy becomes president, even though things show no sign of stopping to degenerate. And I'm not pandering to Evola-thumping authoritarian types either. Do you really believe that the government would suddenly become uncorrupt and efficient if a man with a strong enough presence came into power? The idea that we'll get out of our situation with more politics is a false premise at best, and I don't have the motivation to start memorizing meaningless minutiae so I can prove myself the wiser in a debate with autistically obsessive attack drones on Twitter. Political bickering is like a black hole. It gets bigger the more you feed it. When you engage in the same argument a million times, you're subliminally agreeing that whatever it is you're arguing is relative and up for debate. What people nowadays call the marketplace of ideas is suffering from a bad case of Keynesianism. We have an artificial inflation of ideas. When you get in a debate about something like abortion, which is not at all debatable, all you're doing is contributing to the dialectic of flooding said marketplace with minute arguments, which consequentially devalues argument itself. The quality of discourse is inversely proportional to the quantity of discourse, and currently we have just too much of it. I'm not arguing against argument itself, because that would be contradictory. I'm saying we need argument deflation ASAP. This inflationary practice is nonpartisan. Chapo Trap House listeners will partake in it just as much as Ben Shapiro fans. My favorite group of perpetrators are dissident right-wing types, who will never hesitate to interject their politics into everything on the internet, but then hide their power level in real life. It all stinks of the same pretense. Convince yourself that the only appropriate way to interact with anyone else is by aggressively proselytizing your ideology because you're just too good to have a normal conversation with them. I think that the impersonal way they go about doing things stems from insecurity, because it's easier to talk politics than talk about personal things. But I don't want to get too psychological. On this video at least. Regardless, it leads to the same conclusion. You become insufferable. And then you wonder why you're so dissatisfied with the people around you and vice versa, and end up blaming it on everything but yourself. This isn't the only thing about online political culture that makes me sick though. Just about everything related to it does. The tunnel vision on the same allegedly controversial topics year after year, the romanticized ideological names and symbols, the absolute lack of personal identity that moves in tandem with it, and last but not least, the illusion that all of this is somehow productive. Being in a political argument on the internet is as relevant as winning a League of Legends match, but less entertaining. You're better off watching Minecraft parody songs on YouTube, because at least that'd be funny and novel. The fetishization of debate is a central part of this, because it's what socially inept nerds do when they realize they're too faggy for sports. I'm not saying it can't be entertaining, but most of it is downright jarring, and it's a game of diminishing returns. Watching Steven Crowder get in an argument with an insane woman with an IQ south of 90 is fun the first time, not so fun the seventh. A constructive argument takes hours, maybe days to be productive. You never truly change someone's mind mind in a contrived interaction where you superficially talk to them for half an hour or so. I talked to a girl I actually knew one-on-one about abortion for 90 minutes and the fundamental disagreement wasn't reached. So performing that same rigmarole with someone you're not acquainted with for only 30 accomplishes what exactly? I don't know if people would admit that ultimately debates like those are just for entertainment. Not that there's anything wrong with deriving entertainment from politics. In fact, it's the only acceptable demeanor to have towards it, but it can get pretty dull. It's tough to sell the idea that arguing about immigration with a mental patient for the billionth time is genuinely captivating. At that point, it's just pundits saying what their audience wants to hear. On top of the repetitiveness, most political humor just blows. Good comedy requires an unforeseen point of view, and an ideological perspective makes everything that comes out of your mouth predictable. And then their jokes start coming off more as bland declarations of their opinions with a thin veneer of supposed comedy. Everyone's guilty of being ineffective and or boring, and I get it. Stopping abortion and ending the limits on free speech is important. Talking about it on the internet, however, isn't. Internet arguing is less fighting the fight and more having a fidget. There's no virtue in it. And somehow, you should see all this division as some great product of democracy. We're using terms invented less than a century ago to partake in a political system only a couple centuries old and argue things that were considered undeniably concrete thousands of years ago. And we have to do this because we dumped the knowledge we acquired over millennia and replaced it with platitudes from the Enlightenment. And people, even right-wingers, are so into it that they're willing to make their whole identity out of it. People aren't comfortable with not being immediately categorizable with their political alignment. Every time I see someone merely reference their position on the political spectrum, I want to put a power drill through their eyes. Especially as someone who is savvy with the supposedly more radical places of the internet, I cringe every time I read words like strasserist. Do you really need to identify yourself as that up front? Is that really the most interesting thing about you? People like that are so desperate for in-group acceptance that there's hardly any difference between them and social democrats. Now that I think of it, it's quite fitting, considering how opposed they are to solving our problems ourselves. They're prone to deify the state as some highly sacred entity, which by the way is a very satanic thing to do. People got way more excited about the campaign promise of building a border wall than they got when citizens actually started building the border wall, and way more efficiently than the US government, by the way. All of this feels somewhat intentional, like it's been engineered in such a way that you never truly make a difference in this world. As I've sort of distanced myself from 4chan, I've started seeing it with different eyes, so to speak. It's still being up despite what it contains makes me think it's in someone's interest to keep dissidents on a leash. You give dissidents a place where they can vent freely so they render themselves powerless. Scream into the abyss for a few hours and you'll feel better without actually having to work towards solving the problems that made you feel wrath in the first place. 4chan is to rioting what masturbation is to sex. Why do you think Epstein was killed so blatantly? The people responsible have confidence that the most you'll ever do about it is record a video or make a post. They've got you hooked up to a tube that feeds you bad news 24/7, so they know that in your lays you'll outsource the problem solving. The thing is, you outsource the problems to their talking heads, the politicians. It's also weird how much self-confessed traditionalists act as if their little cyber habitat is the be-all end-all of civilization. If you are truly dissatisfied with modernity, consider the possibility that maintaining a few woke social media accounts isn't activism. Rallies and protests do nothing except affirm the beliefs of those who organize them. Politicians and representatives aren't interested in your well-being, obviously, and the bad things that happen to you because of their actions will never show up at their doorstep. Don't inadvertently blackpill yourself by putting faith in them and their mechanisms. Consider the possibility that if you want society to improve anytime soon, perhaps you'll have to actually do something to make that happen. And before you tell yourself that you're just too small and powerless to do it without the political apparatus, consider that that might just be a rationalization. There's kind of a if you can't beat 'em, join 'em mentality coming from some sects of the right wing that I'm not a fan of at all. Adopting your enemy's tactics makes your position weaker. You're likening yourself to what you recognize to be wrong. The reason the other side sucks so bad isn't just because they have a different end goal than you. Their corruption is weaved into their methods, and you won't make those methods moral by adopting them with a different objective. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit, and you shall know them by their fruits. People who gridlock themselves by politicizing their identity tend strongly to become social pariahs. This cannot be laid exclusively at the feet of PC culture. It seems very right to say that this is also of their own making. Letting an ideology dictate how to structure yourself leaves no room for sincerity, and it's not hard to pick up on. Be it listening to a certain kind of music or making a certain kind of joke, it fundamentally deprives individuals of lateral movement. And all cultural items derived from this insipid mentality are stale by nature because it lacks fluidity. Despite what internet dissidents are painted as, they're quite bloody boring during the intervals between election cycles. I find it very uncoincidental that biblical passages apply so perfectly to this issue. If by now you still haven't figured out what to put faith in if not the current paradigm, let me lay it out for you as clear as I can. Our Lord and and Savior Jesus Christ, and nothing less. If you're thinking ethical standards are a hang-up to protecting your nationality or whatever else, remember that when Pilate asked the chief priests if he was to crucify their king, they replied by saying they had no king but Caesar. Quite honestly, I'd rather be on the pointy end of Longinus's lance if it means I'll be with the man upstairs afterwards.